Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. We have one of the best people who covers the CFL. There's a lot of amazing people that cover the CFL, but the folks at 3 Down Nation are absolutely outstanding and are always on top of things. And today we have the best looking reporter from 3 Down Nation. It is John Hodge, Minnedosa's finest. Welcome to the show, man. It's great to have you on.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, and I'll make sure the audience never finds out I paid you $10 to say that.
Well, anyhow, it's playoff time in the CFL. Things are crazy around the league with the West semifinal and the East semifinal coming up this weekend. The last 6 weeks have really been a roller coaster ride in terms of the standings, some of the games that have been played, the trades, Montreal acquiring Trevor Harris, the firing that happened in Edmonton yesterday. There's just been a bunch of news. But to narrow it down specifically to this weekend, we got the West semifinal and the East semifinal. First, West semifinal. Riders Stamps. Up until the Riders finally slay the Dragon, Craig Dickinson had not beaten his brother as a head coach in a CFL game until this year. What do you expect to see from the West semifinal on the weekend?
Oh, that's a great question. I think Calgary has done a really nice job since the midway point of the season. They were 2-5. I think the quote from Dave Dickinson was they needed to go on a heater, and they managed to do that. They've rattled off 5 consecutive wins. Their only loss really as of late and of note was against the Riders that you mentioned, but that was their 3rd straight meeting, right? They played 3 games in a row at one point against the Riders, which I think is a big disadvantage, honestly, to play the same team three weeks in a row. It's almost impossible in pro sports to beat the same team 3 weeks in a row, particularly in pro football, where so much of what you do is a game plan that's based from week to week to week. And if you have 3 opportunities to prepare for the same team, you better bloody win one of those games. It's pretty embarrassing if you don't. So I think Calgary has done a nice job with their trajectory. I think Reggie Begelton has really breathed some life into that offense. I had some big concerns about Bo Levi Mitchell's weapons coming into the season. I was not a big Josh Huff guy. I'm not sure they play their Canadians in the best spots. Hergy Mayala, they've had him, the former first-round pick out of UConn, playing field side wide receiver. Personally, I'd like to see him in the slot. And that offense struggled, particularly to start the season. Bo Levi Mitchell was throwing a ton of picks. It was ugly. And Reggie Begelton coming in, securing that number 1 spot, if you want to call it, in the receiving core. I think it really frees up a ton of room for Kamar Jordan as the number 2 option to make plays. Kamar Jordan needed to be that number 1 guy to start things off. And I mean, he's 32. He's coming off a terrible knee injury. Granted, it happened 3 years ago, but I mean, he's been through the ringer injury wise. So I think they asked him to do a little bit too much to start the year. Now I think with Begelton, with Jordan, they're set up for success. And I think their defense has come on as of late as well. Like week 1, the D line was a little shaky. I think they were still auditioning some defensive ends. They brought in Sean Lemon late, but they've had Isaac Adeyemi Berglund, the 1st-round pick out of Southeastern Louisiana, step up. So I think they're finally starting to get settled on defense. Brett Monson, I think, is one of the most underrated coordinators in the league. He does great things with that unit. So I think Calgary is peaking at the right time. I think they've got good momentum. On the flip side, I think Saskatchewan could easily win this game. Their defense is solid. AC Leonard, I think, has been phenomenal. Had they voted him most outstanding defensive player, Lucius Purifoy got the nod, but had he been the nominee, I would have been tempted to make him my selection. I don't actually get a vote, but he would have been my favorite potentially to win most outstanding defensive player coming out of the West. To me, the big question with Saskatchewan is just, can that offensive line protect Cody Fajardo? I think that offensive line has been a weak spot for them all year. Brendan Labatt opted out. Taron Vaughn, left tackle's been out all season after undergoing shoulder surgery. So it's not all their fault. They've had a ton of injuries along that offensive line. But to me, I'm picking Calgary in this game. I think it will be close. And I think that Saskatchewan could very much win it. They're a good team. But I think that Calgary's defensive front 7 is going to overwhelm Saskatchewan's offensive protection at times. And I think that Reggie Begelton and Kamar Jordan are going to open things up on offense for Bo Levi Mitchell to get it done at Mosaic Stadium.
You mentioned a lot of names on both sides of the ball for both teams, and the Riders who have specifically had several odd stages of ups and downs during this year. They went in a great win streak, and then after the back-to-back losses to Winnipeg, it seemed to damage them quite a bit. Then the 3 in a row against Calgary, like you said, one of the toughest things to do in football is to beat the same team 3 in a row, especially in the pros. When you're an amateur, there's a lot more disparity in between teams that are good and teams that are bad. So even though I remember when I was playing and coaches would say, well, it's really hard for us to beat the same team 3 in a row. It's like 3 weeks in a row. It's like, well, if they suck, then it doesn't matter. You're still going to beat them. But in pro football, especially between teams that still have a decent rivalry, obviously Saskatchewan and Calgary don't have a rivalry like the Riders do with Winnipeg, but they're still one province over as well to the other side. So that was really interesting and maybe a bit odd in terms of the scheduling to have 2 teams play each other 3 times in a row. And it almost does a little bit of damage, I think, as you were alluding to, because now they don't want to show way too much because, like, what if they have to play each other in the playoffs? But then they have to show all out because they want to win to make the playoffs. But now they're playing each other again in Saskatchewan. So who do you think are the X factors for both teams in the event of either team winning?
Well, I think Duke Williams found a new gear for the Riders, and him and Reggie Begelton are very similar, right? In that they were late season additions coming back from the NFL. Duke Williams was a CFL All-Star with Edmonton in 2019. He goes to Saskatchewan. The connection, of course, being, you know, Paul Jones, assistant general manager for the Riders, was in Edmonton when Duke Williams was there. Jason Moss was the head coach in Edmonton when Duke Williams was there. He's now the OC in Saskatchewan. He had a breakout game, and let's also be honest, you know, Shaq Evans, he had a terrible foot injury he sustained. I think it was week 2, missed almost the whole season. I think he's going to be back to top shape by 2022. But since returning from injury, he has not been the same impactful player. This is a guy who I would have called a top 2 receiver in the CFL in 2019. He's looked ordinary since coming back. I'm not saying he's looked bad. He's just looked ordinary. He's looked like an average receiver. Frankly, they were getting more production out of that spot to the boundary when Kean Schaefer-Baker, the rookie out of Guelph, was playing there. So, you know, I think that Duke Williams is going to be the X factor for sure for Saskatchewan if they win, because him and Cody Fajardo had that breakout game late, and it seems as though he can help fill that vacancy, that void that they really needed as a number 1 target. That was Shaq Evans and just hasn't been Shaq Evans since he suffered the busted foot. On Calgary's side, I'll go with Kadeem Carey. You know, Kadeem Carey, I think, has gotten a lot of love out there. And fair enough. I'm not a huge Kadeem Carey guy. I think he's a good running back. I don't think he's in the same tier by any stretch as William Stanback. I don't think he's in the same tier as Andrew Harris still is. But he's a good, consistent, hard-nosed runner. Saskatchewan, I do think, is a little bit vulnerable against the run. If you look at the statistics, as I do from time to time, you know, Saskatchewan allows some of the least rushing yardage per game, but rushing yards per carry, they were a pretty average defense. Just a lot of teams didn't try to run the ball a whole heck of a lot against them. So to me, I'll pick Kadeem Carey as my X factor for Calgary, because the offense at times in Calgary did start to run through him a little bit, and there's no better way to take pressure off Bo Levi Mitchell than getting that ground game going. The 2-time MOP, 2-time Grey Cup champion, you wouldn't normally talk about taking pressure off of him in a West semifinal game. You know, Bo Levi Mitchell wins these kind of games before breakfast, but he hasn't been the Bo of old this year. And I don't think, you know, we can look at him as Bo Levi Mitchell again until we start seeing those, you know, 300-yard, 3-touchdown games and see him win in the postseason. Because people forget the start of his decline was really the West semifinal in 2019 when he looked miserable against Winnipeg. He hasn't really found that gear yet, that form that put him in the conversation with the greatest players, frankly, of all time. Again, I'm not saying Bo has been bad. Bo just hasn't been Bo, right? Our expectations for Bo Levi Mitchell are almost as high as any player who's played in this league. And I think that's fair because of the remarkable things he's done. But I want to see him get back to that level because, frankly, the CFL is a better league when Bo Levi Mitchell's at the very top of his game.
I remember back, I think it was 2013 and 14, being able to see the battles of like between Edmonton and Calgary, the Battle of Alberta in the West final or in the West semifinal. It was just crazy to think at that time. I was always pondering to myself, there's no way that anyone can really beat Calgary. It seems impossible. The only way Calgary doesn't win the Grey Cup is if they blow it to some lowly Eastern team that surprises them because Calgary gets in over their head or has one of those off games, which can always happen. And that's why the Grey Cup can be magical, because of the fact that it can just snow and Ricky Ray shows up and a few players make some low effort plays on offense when they turn the ball over. 2017 Grey Cup, and boom, there you go. The Argos win. So it'll definitely be interesting to see what will unfold in the West semifinals. So final prediction, who do you take? What's the score?
I'm going to take Calgary. I'll go with 24-19 over Saskatchewan.
24-19, Calgary Stampeders win. Book it. Now, on to the East semifinal. The Montreal Alouettes traveling to Hamilton to play against the Tiger Cats. Hamilton, an interesting team this year with having lost the Grey Cup in 2019. Dane Evans having done an amazing job to help bring the team to the Grey Cup, but not being able to finish the job again first year in as a starter. Not going to give him a lot of flack. This year, there's been a lot of rotation between him and Masoli. Big question going into 2022, who they're going to keep of the two, because I don't see them keeping both of them as they did this year. Maybe a special exception because of recovering after the no season in 2020. What are you expecting to see from the East semifinal? A repeat of Montreal's heroics in Hamilton, or do you think that Montreal's inconsistency is going to prove too much for them to overcome and Hamilton gets the win?
I'm taking Hamilton in this game, and that's not because I don't think Montreal can win. I think Montreal can absolutely win. And Patrick Levels spoke to the media on Monday and guaranteed the win for Montreal, and also called out a bunch of Hamilton's players and head coach, which was delightfully entertaining. We at Three Down Nation don't cheer for teams, but we certainly cheer for storylines. So that was a great storyline, and we appreciate Patrick Levels' willingness to put his neck out there and make those type of comments. That was great. But I'm picking Hamilton, and here's why. William Stanback averaged essentially 100 yards a game this year. He only played the first half of Hamilton's final regular season game, a loss to Ottawa. So, really he played 12 and a half, or he played 11 and a half games. And I think he finished with 1,170 yards, something like that. Anyways, point is he's arguably the most dominant player in the league. He would get my vote certainly out of the East Division for MOP. But in 2 games against Hamilton, he was very ordinary. He was held to just 4.1 yards per carry. That's 2 yards less than his season-long yard per carry average of 6.1. And if you look again, sometimes I think we're guilty of just looking and trying to assess teams based on, how many rushing yards do they allow per game? How many passing yards? That's irrelevant if you don't take into account what the other team has done. And Hamilton, they are not the number 1 team against the run in terms of overall yards allowed. However, they are the number 1 team against the run if you only consider how many actual carries they've faced. They've allowed just 4.2 yards per carry this year, which is the best in the entire CFL. So I like Hamilton's chances of slowing down William Stanback. I think Trevor Harris has been really good since he took over the reins there for an injured Vernon Adams and an injured Matthew Schultz. However, he hasn't put up a ton of yardage. He's been very good at protecting the football. He had 3 touchdowns, no picks in that win against Winnipeg at Percival Molson in week 15, but he hasn't put up a ton of yardage. And I think that if that offense is forced to become one-dimensional and William Stanback is not able to chew up yardage like he did against a number of other teams this year, I think that's going to make life very difficult for Montreal, because they're going to have to ask Trevor Harris to go out there and have a 300-yard game, which is not easy to do. If you look at Carriel Brooks and you look at, Desmond Lawrence, or you look at Tunde Adeleke and some of the ball hawks they have in Hamilton, it's going to be really tough to put together a 300-yard game and not put the ball in harm's way. Especially, I also would say I think Hamilton's defensive line is the best in the CFL. It's certainly the most complete. If you're giving me just the bookends, I'd probably go Winnipeg, or I'd probably go Saskatchewan. But Dylan Wynn and Ted Laurent are probably the 2 best interior guys, at least on the same team in the CFL. And Jagera Davis and Julian Hauser are very good coming off the edge. So if that is what unfolds, and I suspect it might be, I'm picking Hamilton for sure. To me, Montreal has to run the ball well in this game to win. They did not do it successfully in either regular season game against Hamilton. Let's see if they can get it done in the East semifinal.
Trevor Harris is a quarterback to me that has always been in a weird position because going into 2021, I had said, I think that he'll be a dark horse for MLP because he's never gotten the respect he deserves. If you look at his stats, if you look at how well he's played. But there's one thing that Trevor Harris doesn't have that a few of the quarterbacks in the CFL do have, and that's a Grey Cup ring. Now, mind you, I'm not going to sit here and make the argument saying you're not good if you don't win a Grey Cup, because obviously it's a team game. But it started to raise questions for me when I was having a conversation with a friend about the clutch gene or the mystery of the clutch gene with Trevor Harris. And if it is missing from his arsenal, or if there happens to be other things coming into play when it comes to these playoff games that he hasn't been able to win when he has to rise to the occasion, when the moment calls for him to win or make the clutch throw, it hasn't been there from what we've seen so far. Do you think that this is a case of Trevor Harris being in bad positions with the team not being able to give him aid in completing the win? Or do you think maybe this is a little bit of inexperience or just not being able to rise to the occasion when it counts most for him?
That's a great question. I mean, we certainly do judge quarterbacks based on how many Grey Cups they've won as a starter. He did win a Grey Cup in 2016 with Ottawa, but obviously that was Henry Burris at the controls. So, we don't value that the same way. Trevor Harris to me is just a little bit hot and cold, and frankly, most quarterbacks are. Right, Henry Burris. We always talked about good Hank, bad Hank. Kevin Glenn could be an MOP one week, and the next week, fans would be running him out of town. There have been lots of quarterbacks like that, and I think that's more or less. Maybe this is an oversimplification, but I think that more or less stems from just how unbelievably hard it is as a professional quarterback to be at the top of your game at all times. It's the most challenging sport to play, I think, probably in sports in general. It's so demanding. It's an individual sport, but it's also, part of the ultimate team sport. You're one guy, but you're also kind of responsible for the other 11 on the field who may or may not do their jobs effectively or know what their job is on a particular play. And the amount of adjustments you have to make while 300-pound men try to rip your head off is overwhelming. Harris has been brilliant in the playoffs, right? He got Ottawa to a Grey Cup as a starter, albeit didn't win it in 2018. And he also, let's not forget, set, I believe it was a CFL playoff record with 6 touchdown passes in last year's East semifinal as a member of the Edmonton Elks. Now, does that mean he's always been great in the playoffs? No, we've seen him have bad games, have dud games, which to me is honestly maybe the most important thing about finishing first, right, in your division is you cut the number of games you need to play by a chunk. And playing consistently from 1 week to a second week is a hell of a lot easier than week 1, week 2 to week 3. So I do think Harris can win this game and can put up 100 or 300 yards because we saw him do it in 2019 in the East semifinal. But yes, certainly he's struggled to reach that level of like a Michael Riley, who hit that streak for 3-4 years where he was just on permanently. Bo Levi Mitchell, right, not on it right now. We saw it start to unravel late in 2019, but he had a patch of 2, 3, 4, 5 years where it was like Bo's going to be perfect. Therefore, to beat Bo, we have to be perfect. And I don't think Harris is at that level, at least not right now. He has been better in Montreal than he was in Edmonton, but you're right. I do think that is a question that we can ask because he hasn't won a Grey Cup as a starter, and we have seen him, not be at his best in some big games while seeing him play absolutely exceptionally in other big games.
And now keep in mind, as a disclaimer, this is not any slight against Trevor Harris at all. Yeah. I've always been one of the people that touts him from the highest mountains in terms of the CFL quarterback landscape, because I've always felt he doesn't get as much respect as he deserves, or people have always, maybe it's players jawing or bantering in the media saying that he crumbles like a house of cards. I think it was Armando Sewell who had said that when he played against Trevor Harris when he was on Edmonton this year. And he has posted amazing numbers in the regular season. And he did have the outstanding game against the Alouettes last season in the 2019 East semifinal. But again, we as people of the media or fans are always going to judge by wins, losses, Grey Cups, not winning the Grey Cup. So it's just something I thought is interesting to ponder. But at the same time, Trevor Harris is someone I would feel a lot safer with on my team than other backups or people in the league, because he has proven himself that he is a good quarterback in the CFL and does deserve to be a starter on any team. So I did think that was something worth diving into, but at the end of the day,
I'll say this too.
Anything can happen.
You know, fans, I think sometimes, and you see this on Twitter sometimes, right? Fans make a big deal about how much a quarterback wins or loses. And, you know, quarterback wins is not a formal stat, but a lot of the football people I talk to talk about quarterback wins. They'll say things like, well, Matt Nichols, yeah, he's not gonna throw for 400 yards, but he wins, right? Or they're gonna say, well, Bo Levi Mitchell hasn't been as on point this year, but he wins. So I don't think it's just fans and members of the media that focus on quarterback wins. I know a lot of people in the industry who are coaching, who are personnel people, they talk about quarterback wins honestly just as much as the rest of us do, at least from my experience.
And that's a very fair point, because it's the same thing people talk about in other major sports, like, oh, they have a title or they win, like, but it's like Mahomes loses a game and everyone's like, oh, well, he's a fraud. And I'm like, what? Are you insane? Like, he's still so amazing. Guys are allowed to have bad games. It happens. But when it becomes a pattern or a trend, then that's when I think that you can start to read between the lines a little bit more than ignoring the tip of the iceberg. An interesting question that I, again, having with a conversation with another friend, as someone like myself and yourself who have lived in Winnipeg for a long time, this is something that recently came to the surface of my conscience, and I've been having a little bit of trouble grappling with it. When I grew up and in high school, I remembered I loved the 2011 season for the Bombers, but it has a real sour taste in my mouth, obviously because they didn't win the Grey Cup, but not only because of that, because I felt that they started to slow down. And then the next year, Paul LaPolice was let go. And I remember being so excited to see him on the panel because I thought he was like an amazing coach and that he really deserved a lot more respect than the organization had treated him with. Then he came back to Winnipeg, and when they won the Grey Cup and he was the OC, I was so happy and overjoyed, as I'm sure many Winnipeg fans were, to see that reunion and see him get a Grey Cup in Winnipeg, as he so rightfully did deserve. But how he's been with Ottawa is something that has started to raise red flags in my mind. So my question for you is Paul LaPolice as advertised as a head coach, or is he maybe not as cut out for that specific position as people around the league, or maybe fans more particularly, have thought?
That's a fair question. You know, I want to start by saying this. I think Paul LaPolice is a fantastic OC. I think he, and universally, essentially, when you talk to people in the league, they have a very deep respect for his ability to scheme and his ability to call plays. He can take a mediocre set of personnel and turn them into an effective offense. I think he can turn a unit like that and make it more than the sum of its parts. And I think he's demonstrated that consistently. I also love that he's one of the very few CFL OCs who really commits to running the damn football, because very few teams do that effectively. And Montreal did it best this year. Winnipeg did it best in a number of previous seasons. And guess what? When you run the ball well, you always somehow seem to make the playoffs. And you know, when it comes to the head coaching thing, his season this year was a disaster. I don't think there's any way to say that differently. They won 3 games out of 14, and they got smacked a lot. Not every week. They had some close losses, but like 3-11 speaks for itself. Edmonton finished 3-11, and they just fired their CEO, GM, and head coach. Now, I don't think things are toxic in Ottawa the same way that the clubhouse had grown toxic in Edmonton, right? I don't think fans are staying away from TD Place in Ottawa the same way that fans were staying away from Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton, but the record's the same. And, you know, looking at the Red Blacks, yes, talent was a problem, but I think one of the things that's starting to come out, and my colleague Justin Dunk has talked about this, is some of the personnel decisions that were clearly, with hindsight being 2020, errors were maybe not so much focused with Marcel Desjardins, the general manager, making those calls, but it was Paul LaPolice wanting to make that call. So, for instance, the reason that Matt Nichols was the starting quarterback in 2021 as opposed to somebody else was Paul LaPolice saying, "This is my guy. This is my quarterback. We won together in Winnipeg. I want him to be here." I think the reason why he wasn't initially the quarterback in 2020, you'll remember he was coming off shoulder surgery. That's why the team goes with Nick Arbuckle in 2020. Season gets canceled. All of a sudden, hey, it's 2021. Matt Nichols is healthy. Boom, he's my guy now. So I think that's how that timeline worked out. And if you look at guys like Timothy Flanders, who was with Paul LaPolice in Winnipeg, Daniel Peterman, who was with Paul LaPolice in Winnipeg, I think there are more guys who Paul LaPolice played a large role in bringing in. And if you're a head coach, I think you're entitled to have a at least somewhat of a role in personnel, but you have to be right. If you're saying this guy, that guy, this guy is going to make me successful and help this team win games, you have to be right, especially if you're expecting your personnel people whose job it is, right, to bring in the talent, to bring in the players. If you're overruling them or pressuring them to roll with the guys who you want, or the players who you most want to have in your lineup. So I think it's still too early to write Paul LaPolice off as a head coach. I think that Paul LaPolice, again, he's a brilliant schemer. I think he's a great play caller. I think he's highly organized. And when I talked to him in a media availability at the start of the season, and I said, like, what are you doing differently now than you did during your tenure in Winnipeg? And obviously in Winnipeg, he got the short end of the stick because Joe Mack is one of the worst general managers in the history of the CFL. And that's just it's just a fact. So I give him the benefit of the doubt for that. But I'll say this: as much goodwill as he's built up through his great work as an OC, I think 2022 is going to be kind of the last kick at the can, so to speak. Like he got 2.5 years in Winnipeg, should not have been fired in 2012. The general manager, the personnel was more of a problem than the head coach. But 2021 was about as ugly as it could have possibly been for Ottawa. And if you remember back at the start of the season, they were bottom of everybody's power rankings, and the team got awful loud. I'm not saying Paul LaPolice did, but there were members of that organization got awful loud on social media saying, I can't, we started 1-0. How could we possibly be at the bottom of the power rankings? And the rest of the season went by, and I was like, yeah, guys, that's why you're at the bottom of the power rankings. Everybody else saw this coming. You didn't, but the rest of us did. Like, this personnel was never going to get it done. So I think he certainly deserves a chance in 2022. After that, all bets are off. This thing has to work in 2022, in my opinion, if Paul LaPolice is still going to be seen as a viable head coach, because again, he's got some extremely strong areas of ability, but the whole package has not been there. And the first year in Ottawa, again, could not have gone much worse, to be quite frank.
And that's a great analysis, John. I really think that you were spot on with many of the things that you mentioned. And it is important as well to note that Paul LaPolice is a great OC and does have the great ability to scheme. And we're not putting any slight against him, but at the same time, as people of the media or as fans, it is fair to question, well, if the results aren't coming, then when does this thing get going? And the NFL is a great example of seeing how fast things can turn over. Or even if we just dove, you could literally have entire podcast episodes dedicated to, like myself as a Jaguars fan, what does Urban Meyer bring to the team that anyone else wouldn't? Or Matt Nagy is that coach of the Bears, or Adam Gase when he finally went into the spotlight. And then as soon as he was put in the position of head coach, boom, got exposed. So I'm not sitting here saying that I don't think Paul LaPolice can be a head coach in the CFL, but what I'm wondering from the perspective of someone like yourself who has a lot more inside information on speaking with personnel in the league, is Paul LaPolice the complete package, or will he have the opportunity to show that he is the complete package? Because again, the Joe Mack era, I just thought maybe during the time I was like, well, we're just slandering him because we suck or whatever. But now it's like, well, he actually was terrible and was horrible at evaluating Canadian talent. And the fact that Bombers fans had that before the amazing trio of Kyle Walters, Wade Miller, and Mike O'Shea is absolutely mind-blowing to me. And I'm sure it is for everyone else who's a fan of this league, let alone people from Winnipeg. So definitely interesting to see how things will unfold in Ottawa in 2022, especially after having read the article, mind you, posted from the great website that you are a working member of, analyzing the firing of Marcel Desjardins. I remember thinking at first, I'm like, well, this guy's out here touting, we have a chip on our shoulder. And I was thinking to myself, this team doesn't have enough talent to be as good as you think. Not that they have zero talent, because obviously like Devontae Dedman, RJ Harris had flashes. Nate Bahar is a good athlete. The quarterback situation was really tough. Can't really blame Caleb Evans much for what he did, and did have that one great game against the Elks on the at a perfect storm, but really struggled to quarterback, which is the hardest position in all sports, basically, as you had mentioned before. And there wasn't really that much help around. The defense was coached as well as you can with the personnel they had available. But I remember initially thinking, well, Marcel Desjardins, he's got to go. This team's terrible. What's he doing? But then when reading more into it and looking at the personnel decisions Paul LaPolice made, it was interesting to see, okay, maybe the mistake that he made was not how he put the team together. It's who he let have a say in what. And that he has to know the bill stops at him. So he must be responsible for putting his foot down, so to speak. And will this have been a regretful firing by Ottawa? We'll have to see in 2022 and 2023, but it's interesting to see how things will unfold, considering there's more to it than meets the eye from a fan's naked eye.
Yeah, and I don't claim to have the absolute 100% full story of what went on exactly in Ottawa, but I 100% believe Dunk's reporting. It aligns perfectly with the things that I had heard, and that's something that I think we're guilty of sometimes as sports fans. Is we pretend that or we're under the impression that front offices are a monolith and the general manager makes every call. A football clubhouse is like any workplace, right? If you're a good boss or a good leader, your number one job is to surround yourself with people who are going to help make you and one another successful. But also, if all you do is dictate to them and make every little decision and micromanage, you're going to push away your most talented people, right? You're going to push them away, demoralize them, and make them feel like they're not valued. So as a leader, I think it's wise to take on advice and to listen to what other people have to say and take their benefit or give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes, right? And say, okay, if you want to sign this player and you really think he's going to be that good in your system, let's go for it. Even if privately you don't think he's that good, or you don't think that his film, whatever he's put on, whether it's at the pro level or the college level, whatever, is all that to get excited about. But yeah, there are egos behind the scenes. There are politics behind the scenes. Sometimes it depends who's tightest with the owner. Sometimes it's, well, who's tightest with the quarterback. And sometimes, right, people aren't even necessarily hired based on their skills and abilities. Sometimes they're hired based on who else can you get here, right? If you're a general manager and you're interviewing and your team needs a head coach, like for instance, let's use Edmonton as an example. If whoever's conducting those interviews is smart, their first question to every general manager candidate is, who's your head coach? Because if you can bring in and deliver an amazing head coach, you should get that job. Because even if you're the world's greatest GM, if you don't have any idea who your head coach is going to be, or you don't have any of those relationships required to land a great head coach, that's going to have a massively negative impact on your roster, even if you make a great roster. And the second question is going to be, who's your quarterback? Because if you're someone who has a strong pre-existing relationship with the quarterback in the league, if you can deliver a great quarterback, boom, that's your most important job in personnel, right? Is who's the starting quarterback. If you have no idea who the best quarterbacks are in the league and you're flying blind and your answer is, I don't know who the quarterback is yet, I'd have to wait and see who's available. All of a sudden, that's not. So my point is, there's the goings on behind closed doors are remarkably complex, and generally most of that information never comes out. So fans are left to guess, fans are left to speculate. So I was proud of the way that we were able to share that story. Should Marcel Desjardins have been let go? I say yes, because at the end of the day, if the reason that team struggled was Paul Lapolice and not Marcel Desjardins, who hired Paul Lapolice? The answer is Marcel Desjardins. So that's, it's tough to defend the guy who handpicked the head coach, right? Marcel Desjardins did not have to hire Paul Lapolice. He could have hired anybody who wanted that job and interviewed well. He hired Paul Lapolice, and the personnel was not good enough. But I thought we did a good job of bringing some nuance to that conversation, because the conversation, it's not fair to just say, Marcel Desjardins bad, everybody else good. That's the story. Because let's not forget, Marcel Desjardins built 3 different teams that went to a Grey Cup, and they won one of them. And he did that as, a guy who took an expansion team, right? That was an expansion franchise. He built it from nothing to go to 3 title games over a span of, I believe it was 4 years. So, he had proven in the past, this is not a Joe Mack situation where he's a first-time GM and it's a disaster. He was a first-time GM who had a ton of success before things fell off a cliff in 2019, and they had 2 really bad seasons. So, the subtlety and the nuances, I think, are important to report. And whenever you have that information from secure enough sources that you're comfortable reporting it and you know it to be true, I'm glad that 3 Down Nation is able to bring that to the table.
And that's what creates for amazing content and to intrigue CFL fans, because like one of the great ambassadors of the league, Bob Irving, would say, like, we need more people to follow the CFL and to fall in love with the great game that is Canadian football. And I don't care what people say. People talk about the CFL needs to move to 4 downs or dumb down to American football. Canadian football is great to watch and great to follow. And if you don't think so, then you need to watch the CFL and really dive into it, because I get tired of hearing people slander the CFL with the lazy quips. Oh, well, Randy Ambrosie was terrible. Or, 3 downs was boring. How do you have scores like 5-6? Have you seen how high scoring CFL games can be? Maybe this year without preseason and the fact they don't have hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to dispose of makes things a lot more difficult. But if you're going to sit there and slander it, at least give some viable solutions, or just keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what evidence there is to suggest that Canadians would rather watch 4 down football. I think there's evidence to suggest that some young Canadians are watching more NFL than CFL, which is something we can talk about. But the last I checked, like, NCAA college football is not remotely popular in Canada. If that was catching on, or if the XFL or the AAF, right, had been going bonkers in Canada, I think we have some evidence there to suggest, okay, it's not 4 downs, it's the NFL. People like the NFL. They like being able to stream 12 games at once, right, at 1:00 on Eastern time on Sundays. They like having their fantasy football team. They like being able to place bets. They like that. And they like the fact that the media circus surrounding the NFL runs nonstop, 24/7, 365, right? It could be 11 p.m. On the evening in late March, and guess what? There's somebody talking about the NFL. Did something interesting happen? No, but they're talking about the NFL. So are there things the CFL needs to change and improve? Of course. Is making the game more like the NFL going to help? No, because the XFL was a lot more like the NFL. College football is a lot more like the NFL. The AAF was a lot more like the NFL, and the CFL is. None of those things have ever caught on north of the border. Yeah, you can watch college football games on Saturdays on TSN if you want to. Do they do anything in ratings? Not really. And the ratings haven't improved over the last 10 years, whereas ratings for the NFL in Canada have improved remarkably, I think largely due to the birth of mainstream, digital media and things like that becoming so mainstream. It's very easy to follow your favorite NFL team with the internet and podcasts and social media than it is, even 20 years ago. If you were living in Burlington, Ontario, but you wanted to be a San Diego Chargers fan, it's like, well, good luck getting news about the San Diego Chargers. Nowadays that's changed. So yes, the CFL has to change and improve, but I think being different from the NFL is not a disadvantage, it's an advantage. Because if you're going to try to be better than the NFL at the NFL, you're going to lose every time. So why not be the best something else, right? If you're gonna try to be a better NFL in the NFL, that's a waste of time. Just be the best CFL that you can be. And is there room for growth? Absolutely. But anyways, you got to get that.
100%, John. I couldn't agree with you more. Don't try to be better than the NFL at being the NFL. Just be the best CFL. And that's the advantage that we have in Canadian football. And as we are running out of time, I want to wrap up with a few more questions to have a little bit more fun before we part for today.
Sure. Let's do it.
What is your favorite random fact about the CFL that you love to tell our people? Like, first thing that jumps off the top of your head, you're at a party or at hang out with friends, whatever, you're like, boom, did you know X about the CFL?
My favorite fun fact, and then I'll throw a Bombers one at you. In 2013, the Bombers won more games in Montreal than they won in Winnipeg. That's my favorite.
Oh my goodness. That was
bad. You can look it up.
Yeah, the only game they won in Winnipeg was the Banjo Bowl, I think, right?
That is correct. Justin Golds in the Banjo Bowl. But that year and that was the first year they opened their new stadium, right? So yeah, in 2013, if I was to go CFL wide, I think you go with one of the dead players who got drafted, right? It's happened twice that teams have drafted dead players. The fact that we had two teams who had the same name for 40 years, I think is another one. If somebody doesn't know anything about the CFL, Kevin Glenn playing for all 9 teams, or at least being a member of all 9 teams, those are all gold. But I think my favorite Bomber fact that not a lot of people know is 2013, the Bombers won more games in Montreal than they won in Winnipeg, which is sad, but it's true.
That's okay, because that really led to just like lowering our expectations for them to be blown away 6 years later, albeit it took a while, felt more than 6 years, but it eventually came. What is your favorite football movie?
Oh, okay. Respect for the program, Remember the Titans, and a few others, but my number one will always be Little Giants. No question.
Interesting. I've actually not heard that one before, so that's definitely a unique one.
It's before your time. It was my favorite movie when I was about 6 years old, and whatever movie is your favorite movie when you're 6 years old, it's gonna be one of your favorite movies forever. At least it is for me. So I love Little Giants.
What is your favorite sport to play besides football?
My favorite sport to play is curling, followed closely by basketball. I don't claim to be particularly good at either, but I'm big and I'm physical, so I can be pretty ruthless under the boards. But those are my top 2 to play.
Favorite childhood sports memory?
Oh, that's a good question. I generally, the teams I played for were bad. And I'm smart enough to realize that what all those teams had in common was me. So unfortunately, I probably had something to do with that. But when I was in the 8th grade, my junior high boys basketball team won our local title, our divisional title, and that's the only thing I won in amateur sports. Like, that's the only title I won. So that'll be the number one for me.
Who is your favorite head coach in pro football history?
Oh, that's a good question. Favorite head coach in pro football history?
It could be NFL or CFL.
This might be an unfair answer because I never actually got to see him coach, but I would put Bud Grant as my answer, because learning about Bud Grant and the ridiculous things that he accomplished and the fact that he's still kicking ass at 94 years old, and the success he had at both the CFL, NFL, the fact that he became a head coach at the age of 29, was 1 year removed. He also won an NBA title. Like, we're talking about one of the greatest head coaches. Yeah, he won an NBA title in 1950. He was drafted by, I think it was the Minnesota Lakers. Yeah, pretty unbelievable. So I'd have to go Bud Grant. I think he's, the otherworldly, like one of those legendary people who, 500 years from now, I hope people are still talking about Bud Grant and the amazing things that he accomplished. Just in general, professional football, professional basketball, life. the guy's a legend, and I'm glad that we still have him around.
My final question for you, John, is what is the most shocking sports memory that you saw either live or on television as a kid?
I think the most shocking thing I saw live as a kid,
Like under 18. So you can be
under
up to
18. Well, let's go with the Bomber game. What was the most shocking thing I saw? One play that immediately stands out. This happened just after I became an adult, but I think that was 2011. That was the year. No, 2010. Okay, I'm cheating a little. I was 19 when this happened. I'm going to cheat a little tiny bit. But when I was 19, it was 2010. That was Paul Appolice's first season in Winnipeg. I was a season ticket holder. And that was I believe it was the Thanksgiving game.
Thanksgiving.
When the BC Lions came to play, and Alex Brink got the start. Was horrible. I think he was 4 for 18 or something like that to start the game. And there were rumors already circulating that starting Alex Brink was not a Paul Appolice decision, but a Joe Mack decision. And they pulled him for Stephen Giles. Stephen Giles came in, led the team back. I think they were down some like 22. And the moment I remember, I'll tell you, I'll add a bonus part to the story. So the main part I remember was Dion Beasley in overtime, who was playing cornerback at the time. He picked off Casey Printers, who I think that was his last game of CFL football.
Yes.
Basically Dion Beasley picked sixed him and then kicked him out of the league. And the reason I remember that game is because, first of all, it was just wild to hear the stadium rally for Stephen Giles, hoping that he would play. Secondly, I've never seen a walk-off, or at least not live. I'd never seen a walk-off pick six like that. I'd never seen, and I'm pretty confident to this day, it's the only game in CFL history that went to overtime, but was decided by a double-digit score, right? Because the Bombers scored a touchdown in overtime, got the pick six. So they won by 12. I think they won by 12 points.
12, yeah, 47.
They won in overtime. There you go. You remember the game. And here's the second part I remember. So the year after this occurred, 2011, my brother and I were at the Bomber store at Old Canadian Stadium, and there were game-worn jerseys for sale. And my brother bought the Dion Beasley. I'm not verified, but we thought there was a decent chance it was the Dion Beasley jersey that Dion Beasley was wearing when he made the pick six. So my brother bought it and tweeted about it. This was when Twitter was brand new, right? This is like 2011. And Dion Beasley saw it and tweeted back. He was like, "Hey man, I'll sign that jersey for you sometime if you're around." So one day, my brother and I are back at the Bomber store like months later. And my brother had let Dion Beasley know ahead of time, this is where I'm going to be. This is what's going on. So anyways, we're in the Bomber store and a car pulls up, really nice car. And Dion Beasley steps out, and I don't know if he had a smoke machine in the car, but there was a large flume of something that dispersed into the air as he stepped out of the car. And I'm not even sure he said a word. He was moving very slowly. He just kind of smiled. He signs the jersey, gets back in his car, drives off. I have no idea what it was. It was dramatic. And anyways, yeah, he's obviously was a character, Dion Beasley, but that to me is probably the memory that sticks out the most for watching games live growing up, attending Blue Bombers games in Winnipeg.
That game on television was insane. I couldn't have imagined what it would have been like to see it live. I do have a friend that says that's his favorite memory as a Bomber fan at a live game ever. And considering they went 4-14 that year, and that Stephen Giles was basically left with not much of a roster, is pretty incredible that they were basically able to end Casey Printer's career literally on a pick six, and have been probably the only, we'll have to eventually fact check this, but the only double-digit overtime victory in league history. So John, with that, I want to thank you so much for having been on today's episode. It was a great pleasure, and I feel like we could literally walk into a black hole talking about Canadian football. But for the time we had today, it was amazing. I'm really glad that we got to connect as Winnipeggers about the greatest game that we have, Canadian football. Thank you so much. It was a great honor.
My pleasure, Matthias. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to the listener for enjoying today's episode with 3 Down Nation contributor and the finest man with facial hair in the Canadian football media, John Hodge.